Growing up in Southern California during the 80s, one of my favorite things to do was dump quarters in video games at a local bowling alley in Westchester. The bowling alley is still there, but I doubt they still host those old arcade games I used to love to play as a kid. One of my favorites was Marble Madness, a game that required you to use a trackball to race a marble through a maze. Along the way, you'd run into obstacles like competing marbles that would try to knock you off track, monsters that could paralyze and eat you, and pools of acid that could dissolve you, all while trying to make it to your goal before your time ran out, and all set to some really intriguing 8-bit music. Well, my son enjoys playing video games today as much as I did when I was his age, but the ones he plays are way too advanced for me, so we decided to build our own arcade machine to bring back the simplicity of the games I grew up with. We started by picking up this book by John St. Clair, a good first read on what to expect in putting one of these cabinets together. The book includes directions for 2 builds. Since this was our first build, we decided to go with the easier plans, which are freely available on the web at the link shown on this slide. The build requires 3 sheets of 4x8 plywood, but we managed to get it down to 2 sheets by making the cabinet sides a little thinner and putting them both on 1 sheet. And here's the finished product. This is the final cabinet, which is running Retropie on a Raspberry Pi computer. The project took us about 2 months from start to finish. I won't go into all the details, but figured it might help some dads or moms or kids out there to see what the process looks like before making this jump. One of the first things you're probably wondering is, how much does a project like this cost? Well, I saved all my receipts from various retailers and totaled them all up and inventoried everything in a spreadsheet, which is linked to the description of this video. The bottom line is, if you want to build one of these from scratch and you don't have any tools or materials, plan on spending a little over $1,700 for everything you'll need. That's almost exactly what you might pay for a restored original arcade cabinet, shipping included. So if you have the money and you just want a quick fix, that might be the better way to go. In my case, I had many of the tools on hand, so my final cost was a little over $1,100 and about 2 months to complete the project from start to finish. Obviously, you're going to want a circular saw and a fine-tooth circular saw blade, an extension cord, drill bits to go with your 18-volt cordless drill, carpenter's pencil, and a mechanical pencil. I find that mechanical pencils are really nice for creating nice, thin, clean lines when you're drawing out your plans on your plywood. I prefer to use these actually. Clamps of various sizes are also helpful. A router, along with these 2 bits, a router wing slot cutter and a plunge bit. Ear protection and eye protection to go with your router. Tape measure. You're also going to need a jigsaw with fine-tooth blades. 1 1/8 inch Forstner bit to help you cut holes in your control panel for seating your buttons. And it's also helpful to have a number 8 countersink bit and a number 2 Phillips drill bit for tying everything together. Sanding disc to go with your circular sander. Hole saws, I've also seen these referred as paddle bits on the web. A rubber mallet, that's going to help you apply your T-molding to your cabinet. A square, and also a metal ruler for making smaller measurements. And a dust brush for cleaning things up at the end of the day. And then also you're going to want a T-square and a cutting guide. This will help you make nice straight cuts that are at right angles on your plywood. And a sawhorse is essential. And I really like these storeway sawhorses. I don't have a lot of space in my garage, and they're just really easy to fold up at the end of the day and get out of the way and make room for your car. You're also going to want a broom and dustpan, and probably most important of all, you're going to want some space to work in. So here you can see that our plywood is resting on top of the sawhorse, and Noah's using his T-square to make sure that the plywood is squared up as recommended in John St. Clair's book. Okay, the next thing you're going to want to do is get your plans ready for transferring the cut lines onto your 4x8 pieces of plywood. And remember that we're going to actually mirror one of the cabinet sides onto one of the pieces of plywood This eliminates waste and cuts down the number of needed pieces of plywood from 3 to 2. And I'll show you a few photos of Noah drawing out the cut lines on the piece of 4x8 plywood. You can see he's using a T-square to make sure that the lines are parallel and perpendicular where needed. We want everything to be nice and square here. And here you can see that we've got both sides of the cabinet on one piece of plywood. And before we make any cuts, you're going to want to make sure that you use a T-square to line up your straight edge to guide your saw along those cut lines. And the T-square and the straight edge will make sure that everything is nice and square and straight when you do your cutting. And here you can see that our first cut's been made, and now we just need to cut out the cabinet sides. And those are the cut lines for the cabinet sides that are highlighted, just to show you what it looks like. And here you can see that I've made my first cut with my jigsaw on one of the cabinet sides. And the way you do those right angles is you can drill a hole with a paddle bit or a hole saw, and that should allow your jigsaw to make a right angle right there where the control panel is going to seat on that cabinet side. And on this slide you can see that Noah's using that straight edge, which he lined up with a T-square, so that the blade on the jigsaw is cutting right along the line that we've drawn on the plywood. And here's our first cabinet side that's been removed from our first piece of plywood. And jigsaws are really good for doing these curved cuts like the one that you see pointed out in blue font on this slide. And here's our 2 cabinet sides that have been released from our 4x8 piece of plywood. And you'll want to use a router with a wing slot cutter to cut slots around the cabinet sides, and this is what's going to be used to host the T-molding to give it a really nice finish. And here's Noah building the cabinet base. Right here he's attaching the wheels. And make sure that your bolts are facing down towards the wheels when you do this. The first time we did this we had the bolts facing up, which would have been up inside towards the cabinet, which is something you don't want. You actually want them facing down so that they're not in the way. And here's basically all our cabinet parts with my spare 4x8 piece from the plan modification, which I've kept on hand in case we make any mistakes. Okay, and this next slide basically shows how to attach the 2 cabinet sides to the cabinet bottom, the one with the wheels. And what you'll want to use is the cabinet front to kind of provide something for the cabinet sides to rest on. And you want to make sure that those sides are level, so use a bubble level to check the same. And on this slide, you just want to make sure that the back side of the cabinet is also square, one side with the other. So use a bubble level with your guide to kind of position and get this all lined up so everything's nice and square with the cabinet bottom, and that the 2 cabinet sides are right with one another. Next, you're going to want to draw a line on the cabinet side where you're going to drill your pilot holes that are going to go from the cabinet side to the cabinet bottom. And you're going to want to make sure to countersink those pilot holes. And then next, you're going to want to tie it all together with your wood screws. And here you can see that Noah is using some brackets to tie the other cabinet side to the cabinet base while everything is squared up. And although you can't see it in this slide, there's actually the cabinet backside bottom inserted between the cabinet sides. And here you can see that I'm using a level to make sure that that's nice and plumb relative to the cabinet sides. And you can see here that I'm going to use my T-square to draw a line to approximate where I should be drilling those pilot holes to tie that cabinet backside bottom to the cabinet sides. Next, we're going to basically flip the entire assembly over, position the second cabinet side, and repeat everything that we did before to make sure that everything's nice and square. And here you can see that we're installing the cabinet back top section between the two cabinet sides. And in this slide, you can see that I've positioned my cabinet back angled section and my cabinet top between the two cabinet sides using a clamp. And what I'm trying to do here is just basically test fit everything using the clamp to hold it in position. And here you can see the braces, and you can see the cabinet top and the cabinet back angled section that have basically been tied into those braces. The cabinet back angled section was a little tricky. It takes two 45-degree angle cuts. Notice the way those cuts are made to tie into the cabinet back top section and the cabinet top. And here you can see that I'm basically test fitting where my speaker panel is going to go. I've got this basically held in place with the clamp, and then I'll draw a line on the cabinet side once everything is level and where I want it to be, so that I can put some more braces to tie into right here. And here you can see the braces for my speaker panel. This is actually not screwed in yet. The speaker panel still needs to have some holes routed in it for the speakers, which I'll show shortly. And the next few slides basically demonstrate how I put the control box together. And here you can see that I used a hole saw to drill a hole in the back of the control panel, and that's going to allow us to run wires from the keyboard emulator to the Raspberry Pi that's going to be inside the cabinet. And here are some templates that we downloaded from slackcoin.com to basically help us determine where we're going to put our joystick holes and how we're going to mount our buttons. Show me what that tool looks like, Noah. What is that? It's a punch. And here's our control panel that's been marked with our punch to help us guide our Forstner bit to determine where we're going to drill our holes. Yeah, you're good. There you go. And here you can see that we're test fitting our control panel on the cabinet, and it's finally starting to look like an arcade machine. So here you can see that I'm using a clamp to basically place a piece of scrap wood next to the control box to kind of help me determine where my monitor stand is going to be located. I should note that the design that I eventually went with was to basically have a hanging monitor that I could swivel so that I can get different aspect ratios. But this monitor stand was useful for blocking light from behind the cabinet, so it was a good thing to do regardless. And here you can see that I'm trying to basically level everything out with the top of the control panel on the cabinet. And I've inserted a couple pieces of scrap on the cabinet sides to basically hold the monitor stand. So in this slide, you can see that basically what I'm doing is recycling a couple of old speakers from a stereo that I inherited from my dad like 20 years ago. And what I'm doing is using the speaker cover to mark drill holes for mounting those speaker covers and for also guiding where I should be routing holes in this speaker panel. And here you can see that I've just taken some scrap wood and I've just kind of placed the speakers where I want them and then glued that scrap wood in place to keep the speakers from sliding around on the speaker panel. And here's the display mount that I purchased on Amazon. These are really nice because they allow me to hang the monitor off the back of the cabinet rather than having the monitor sit on a piece of plywood in the cabinet. More importantly, they allow me to swivel the monitor so I can get different aspect ratios depending on what game I'm interested in playing. In order to use this mount, you'll have to remove the original display mount off of your LCD monitor, and you'll want to replace it with the alternative mount that's included with the kit that you purchased on Amazon. Now, when I originally purchased this mount, I thought I'd be able to anchor it directly to the back of my cabinet, and I realized later that I actually had to put this on a angled piece of wood. Otherwise, the monitor will have a tendency to lean forward. And another mistake I made was to actually place this mount or to screw it in to that piece of scrap wood dead center in the middle of the cabinet. Actually, what you need to do is you need to move this slightly to the right, because when the monitor pulls out, it actually comes out a little off-center, biased to the left. So you're going to have to bias the installation of this monitor mount a little bit to the right. About an inch should be enough. So in order to hide the open part of the cabinet that's going to be sitting behind the monitor, I purchased some cheap whiteboard or dry erase board, and I cut it to size for mounting behind the monitor. And the reverse of this material is going to be black, which is exactly what I want. And here you can see my monitor installed on the monitor mount with the black material in the back to kind of hide things, but I still have this really bright silver bezel around the monitor. And the way to fix that is just to cover the bezel with some black electric tape. That works just fine. And again, the really nice thing about this monitor mount is you can quickly change your monitor from being in landscape mode to portrait mode, and that might be a function of what game you decide to play. Some play better in landscape and some play better in portrait. And this just basically shows you what it looks like when you have a piece of smoked plexiglass installed in front of the monitor and the backing. When you turn this on, the only thing you'll really be able to see is the monitor. And this basically shows the coin door installed in the front of the cabinet. Right now it's just kind of held in place because it's a nice tight fit the way things are cut. However, I decided to install European hinges so that I could open and close that front door for access to the inside of the cabinet. This is optional. You really don't have to do it. You can get access to the cabinet from the open areas in the back. And this is basically the cutout template provided with my coin door. So what I did was I kind of centered it where I wanted it, and then I took my punch tool and marked the four corners, removed the template, and then drew a line between those markings on the front cabinet with a ruler so that I'd have a guide for my cut lines. Okay, next I used wood putty to basically smooth out any rough grain on the cabinet sides. And then I used the wood putty to fill in any gaps, and then I sanded everything smooth. And as I mentioned previously, I used a Raspberry Pi loaded with Retropie and a few ROMs I picked up on Amazon. And then I mounted the Raspberry Pi on the inside of my cabinet towards the back where it would be easily accessible from that open area. With the Raspberry Pi installed and the monitor hanging on the mount, I finally had a chance to power things up and see what it would look like. So for my marquee, I decided to use some of this angle aluminum material that I picked up from Home Depot at relatively low cost. I then cut the material to size with the hacksaw and test fit it where my marquee will be installed. So this is some scrap whiteboard that was left over from the work that I did to create the back of my display. And this is perfect for covering an aluminum foil. And then hot glued some NeoPixels so that I can create some nice lighting effects for my marquee. I went ahead and I attached an Arduino to the back of that material. And the Arduino is basically what I'm going to use to program and drive those NeoPixels. You don't have to use NeoPixels. You can also use just a fluorescent light bulb. This was just something that I had on hand that I wanted to experiment with. And this just shows how I install those angle brackets to create a seat for the marquee. So basically what I did was I used a couple clamps to basically hold them in place and applied a little bit of JB weld so that everything would anchor nicely to the cabinet. And this is the marquee that I selected for my cabinet. And the reason I chose this one is I thought I could get some really cool lighting effects with those NeoPixels. So it actually turned out really nicely. And here's my marquee. It's just arrived and I'm just about to open it up. And unfortunately the marquee was just a hair too wide for my cabinet, so I had to take it to my local hackerspace where they graciously let me use their grinder to basically take about 1/16 of an inch off, and after doing that it's set very nicely in the cabinet. So here you can see that the marquee is basically resting on the bottom angle bracket, and rather than glue in the top angle bracket, what I did was I attached it with Velcro, and this allows me to easily remove that top bracket, slide the marquee out in order to service the speakers or the Arduino and the NeoPixels or do anything else I need to do in the top of the cabinet. So we decided to protect the top of the control panel with some adhesive backed vinyl. So this came in a standard size that was just perfect for a control panel from, I think it was Twisted Quarter. So after the adhesive back vinyl has been applied, Noah went ahead and he measured around the control panel, and then he cut some T-molding to length, and then starting in the back of the panel he started applying that T-molding. And there are plenty of videos on YouTube that explain how to do this. I won't go into too much detail. Suffice it to say that having a rubber mallet to attach this T-molding is really helpful. And it's helpful to have an X-Acto blade to cut away the adhesive back vinyl from your control panel holes where your buttons are going to be installed. And just to note here that it's a good idea to have a multimeter set on continuity mode. And what I like to do is just check continuity between the leads going from the buttons to the terminal block on the keyboard emulator. That'll avoid any frustration later on if your buttons aren't working. Just test things out while you're putting stuff together. It really helps. And here's our control panel all wired up, all tested, and ready to go. Okay, next it was time to install our smoked plexiglass onto the cabinet, and the way I did this was to basically put a little piece of scrap wood on the speaker panel that the top of the plexiglass could rest on. And then basically have the bottom of the plexiglass resting on the supports meant for the monitor stand. And to make this plexiglass easy to install and remove, I actually had it cut about 3/8 of an inch shorter than what would be required. And this allows me to basically insert it into the cabinet, lift it up, and then put a couple shims underneath. Giving it a little bit of flexibility makes it a lot easier to remove and install this plexiglass over time, particularly if I want to change the aspect ratio on the monitor. And here's the completed cabinet with the control panel installed. I've got the marquee installed on the top. I've got T-molding going around the edges to make the finish look nice. You'll notice the coin door is in the front panel that has a second lock that's for the front cabinet door that's resting on European hinges so that I can open that front and close it as needed. And the whole thing is resting on polyurethane wheels, which is really nice because now I can wheel it out of my workshop and into the living room where it's currently residing.